Sometimes you might feel stuck or overwhelmed, but you don't need more and better information. Sometimes you need to engage your story in a new and different way to better understand how the past influences the present. That is what we are talking about today. Welcome back. This is the Attention to God podcast. I am Jeff Holsclaw, your host, and we are looking to explore neuroscience informed spiritual information. And as always, we are produced by Embodied Faith. And today, as our guest, we have Adam Young, whom I've heard about for several years from different people. He is a therapist who is focused on trauma and abuse and is the host of his own podcast called The Place We Find Ourselves. He currently serves as a fellow and instructor at the Allender Center and just published a book titled Making Sense of Your Story: Why Engaging with Your Story with Kindness, which I think is key, which we're going to get to. With kindness changes everything. Adam, thank you so much for being on today.
Jeff, it's good to be with you.
Yeah, I appreciate you making some time. I canceled earlier. I got sick when we were supposed to schedule, but I'm so glad that you're on today. Could you, we all have different kind of stories maybe about how we got into the work we do. Could you just kind of lay out a little bit, like what were some of the stepping stones that led you to the place of being a therapist and doing all those things that you do?
Sure, I was a pastor before I was a therapist, and the part of pastoring that made me come alive the most besides preaching, was engaging with people one-on-one,
Mm,
particularly taking them into their stories and linking what they were struggling with in the present to their past story growing up in their family. And so it was just a natural shift for me I had already earned a master's degree in social work right after undergrad. So it was
mm.
kind of the right season for me to dive into therapeutic work full time. And I did that in 2013.
So you didn't love like the staff meetings and the budget planning
No,
sessions and the event plan. You didn't love the aspect of running a small business, being a pastor?
correct.
All right. Well, excellent. So what are some of your, like being a therapist is real broad. It's huge, a lot of, so what do you kind of focus on and how did you kind of get, really interested in your particular expertise?
Well, I work exclusively with adults, half couples, half individuals, and the people that I work with have a history of trauma.
Mm,
So, especially sexual trauma, sexual abuse. That's kind of what I focus on. That's my favorite uh, category to engage. And I have been trained in story work methodology by Dan Allender and the Allender Center. And so I bring in a lot of attachment science, a lot of neuroscience, scripture, spirituality, and story work. And that's kind of how I approach whoever I'm sitting across from.
So what is story work, as like a therapeutic modality or even a spiritual formation kind of perspective? How would you summarize that?
Story work is looking at the particular narratives from your growing up years, incidents, scenes that you remember, and you may not be sure why you remember them. And you likely don't remember the full story, but you remember a fragment, you remember a partial scene. And we start with what you remember, especially from 0 to 18, so that we can understand how the neurons in your brain have been shaped, connected, configured, so that we can understand why you experience your present adult life the way you do. Because neurons that fire together, like they wire together. That's the phrase.
Mhm.
And so
Right.
when you've had an experience, particularly of harm, not necessarily trauma, but harm in your younger years, that shapes the way the neurons in your brain have connected. And we want to understand that so we can understand you.
Mm. So then why does making sense of your story? You wrote a whole book, right? Make sense of your story. How does that help people move forward then? Why isn't it just like dwelling on the past? Or, that's some people might say, like my past is my past and I'm focused on the future. So why does focusing on story matter so much?
Because in order for you to experience what the Hebrew Bible calls shalom, integration, wholeness, you have to make coherent sense of your own developmental story. In other words, your growing up experiences need to be coherent. They need to make sense to you for the neural networks in your brain to be well connected, well integrated. The nature of trauma, the nature of harm is disintegration or fragmentation in the brain. And when you're able to tell your story coherently in a way that makes sense, and you as a boy or a girl are named well in the context of those stories, the fragmentation ceases to be fragmentation and it becomes integration, wholeness, shalom.
So what would be, I have lots of questions about the Shalom and Old Testament, so we're going to get back to that. But what would be like indicators or markers of like a disintegrated story? Like how does that come out in your life or maybe in your memories and how you organize those things?
Well, the way most people talk about it is they get triggered or they have what they call overreactions. So this happens especially in relationships that are important to us. There's a look on her face, there's a tone in her voice, and all of a sudden we are either feeling deep levels of shame or anger or fear, anxiety, big emotions that feel to us disproportionate to the circumstance. And we might call that a trigger. We might call that an overreaction, whatever you call it. It's making implicit memory known. So you're remembering something from your past. You just don't have the sensation of recall. So you don't know you're remembering anything. And there,
Mm,
in that sense, present day difficulties can become clues to your past story.
mm. Are there clues in the sense of like little bits of disintegration that are showing up and kind of invading the present, like that kind of way?
Well, it's giving you a roadmap to be curious about why did I just react so strongly in
Mhm,
that interaction? Why am I feeling these big feelings in my body? Or why am I shutting down and going numb in this interaction? And those questions, if they are questions, if they are brought with curiosity, can lead you into the truth of your past story.
So, how do you talk about approaching your story with kindness? Why is that kind of the key kind of component in some of the story work that we're doing?
Because hospitality, in other words, welcome, a posture of, I want to hear from you, younger Adam, is the key to rewiring neural networks. If I won't listen and pay attention to the stories that my body holds, then I can't integrate those stories. If I dismiss them as no big deal, or worse, if I feel deep levels of shame or self contempt because I hate what that 10-year-old boy did, well,
Mhm,
then there's a sense of the fragmentation, the cutting off being strengthened. I've
mm,
exiled that boy from me rather than
mm,
welcoming him, listening to him, and bringing to him some care and some attention.
mm. I just wrote down the question about like parts or internal family systems, parts work. Is that kind of not that? Does that dovetail a little bit with this question of disintegration and stories and the kind of the
Oh,
younger self?
absolutely. That's
Okay.
internal family systems was developed by Richard Schwartz, and one of his great insights is that human beings are a multiplicity of parts. We are not one unitary self. All of us, we have angry parts, we have scared parts, we have parts of us that are ashamed, parts of us that are 6 years old, parts of us that get aroused. We are a multiplicity of selves. And what I'm inviting the reader to do is to welcome all of those parts and listen to the younger you.
Yeah, and I really like how you kind of organize the different kind of story questions because you talk about engaging, the story of your family of origin, but also the story of your body, the story of your sexuality, sexual life, listening, collective stories, as well as life with God. And so those are all just kind of like different ways of engaging the story. It's really compelling for some people like me. I'll just speak for myself, right? I kind of have resistance about like exploring my story. And there's a reason with like avoiding or dismissive attachment that actually doing that story work can be difficult. So, what are some of the common objections to doing the story work that you run into? And how do you kind of help people to engage it?
Well, you've already named one of them, which is the past is in the past. I'm supposed to pay attention to the present and the future, not dwell on the past. I mean, that phrase dwell on the past is pejorative in our culture. Another
Mhm.
big one is I don't want to blame my parents.
Yeah.
Lots of people have the posture of, look, my parents did the best they could. Yeah, they were imperfect people. I don't want to blame them. I don't want to be a victim. Therefore, I'm not going to look back at what happened to me as a boy or a girl.
Mhm.
And the way that I address that objection is simply the truth. According to Jesus, it's the truth that sets you free. But the truth requires you to have eyes wide open to what it was like for you as a boy or a girl in your family with regard to the harm that your parents did. And all parents do harm. I'm a parent, I do harm. To be a human being is to, at times, harm others, especially our children.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
therefore, what's keeping you from looking at the ways that your parents harmed you when your brain was developing at the most rapid rate, namely when you were younger?
Mhm. Well, you don't push back exactly in the book with this phrase, but I just want to try this out. Is I often hear something like when they're talking about parents, uh, something like they did the best they could with what they had,
Mhm.
uh, which sometimes is true, but many times it's not, right? So as an excuse for or dismissing kind of these harms or traumas that our parents kind of engage us in, how would you address that? Because sometimes we idealize our parents when really we need to be looking at them maybe a little bit more. I don't know what word you'd put in there, critically or truthfully. Uh,
The word I would put in there is with honor. Honor
okay.
requires honesty. And so
Mhm.
if someone has the objection or the felt sense
Honor
of
sounds like it's from the Bible. Isn't that like the fifth commandment or something like that?
it's from the Bible. We're
Yeah.
called to honor our parents. And if you have
Yep.
the objection, my parents did the best they could, that's a really odd thing for someone who self identifies as Christian to believe. Because according to the Bible, no one does the best they can.
Mhm.
Sometimes I do my best, and sometimes I do harm and I fail and I fall short. And that's also true of your parents. But can you put down on paper 3 to 5 ways that your parents failed to do the best they could? 3 to 5 times when your parents harmed you. Can you write
Mhm.
out those stories? And if not, what's keeping you from that level of honor and honesty?
Mhm. As you know, the research for like secure attachment or insecure attachment has that ability to be honest about the failures of our parents without necessarily like making them, villains in our story.
Mhm.
But we're not idealizing or dismissing or making excuses. And so it's often that this disintegration that you're talking about where we either blame our parents for everything or we absolve them from any wrongdoing, and that's often a marker of disintegration. Before we move into like the more spirituality kind of aspect, then um what would be the difference between engaging your story like at a deep level and then just kind of remembering it and listing some things? Like, is there a couple different practices or a couple different like kind of ways to make sense of that difference?
The biggest difference is to engage your story at a deep level, you need to write on paper 2, 3, 4 of the pivotal stories of your life. And you may not think of them as pivotal. You may not think of them as a big deal, but you remember them and you're not sure why. That's step
Mhm.
one. Step two, you have to read that story to a trained, wise guide who can help you explore it in depth. None of us can
Mhm.
engage our stories well by ourselves because it was just the water we swam in. It's the way things were for us. So we
Mhm.
need other eyes, other voices to name us well in the context of our stories.
And when you say write that down, is that write by hand or can you type it out? Just
You can
curious.
type it out.
Oh, okay. All right. I know some people are very much like the integrative embodied aspect of writing by hand, so I wasn't sure. Well, so to shift then a little bit, how does all of this work like in our spiritual lives? Like what does it mean to engage your story with God? And maybe let's shift a little bit into like kind of attachment. How does God fit into this?
Well, to be human is to be marked by deep desires and deep disappointments. That's the nature of living in the world that we find ourselves in. All of us carry within us desires that have been unmet, moments where hopes have been shattered, deep disappointments have piled up. And when we grapple with the realities of the particularity of those disappointments in your life, in my life, it implicates God, because God is the one who, like in all capitals, the one who could have prevented it. So with trauma and abuse, the bind you're in, if you self-identify as a Christian, is how could God have let that happen? And if you're not asking that question and bringing those questions to God in some sort of prayerful engagement, then what I would say is you're cutting off a big part of your heart.
Mm.
You're exiling anger, fear, doubt, because it's not appropriate for a Christian to express or feel those things.
So, what would be some like layers to work through when it comes to your story with God? Like, how do you start like kind of peeling that onion with people you work with, or when you're just kind of engaging with others?
Well, I just invite them to identify what they feel towards God and express it to God. And for a lot of people, that's a big struggle because they come
Mm.
in with a lot of Christian cultural baggage that you're not supposed to express grief. You're not supposed to express anger. You're supposed to rejoice in the Lord always, not be sad. You know, don't let the sun come, the sun go down on your anger. You're not supposed to rage at God. And I get that people feel that way. The Bible strongly disagrees with you.
Yeah, especially the Book of Psalms. Well, where in the Bible then? Because you probably work with some people. I was raised fundamentalist, right? So it's like the Bible, the Bible, the Bible. So how do you kind of work around some of those texts? Like, where do you point people toward to show that like fuller story of emotional life in Scripture?
Psalms, Lamentations, Jeremiah, Book of Job.
Mm.
It's all those books. If you actually read those texts, you will find, you don't have to create the language, you will find the language of accusation directed at God, expression of anger at God already in the text for you, and
Mhm.
you can borrow it and make it your own.
Yeah, I remember being raised, and I'd read the Psalms, and there was like five Psalms that made any sense to the theological system that I had. There were like the three that were like very confessional, right? Like Psalm 51. Then there was the other couple that were like very Christological, which was like, pointed to Jesus. And then the rest were just like dismissed because they're like either sad or they're happy or they're just like all the emotions. It wasn't until I developed a much more kind of rich emotional repertoire where then I was like, oh, the Psalms are they speak about sadness and disappointment and joy and anger toward God, anger toward others. More disappointment, 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 and then you start trending to the last, 42 more joy and things like that. So, yeah, our religious upbringing kind of, you know, ruins those Psalms for us. How does to attachment then? How do you work in kind of the story with these ideas of secure and insecure attachment? How do you see those working together? How would you kind of explain insecure attachment just to start off with?
Well, insecure attachment, and it can take a variety of forms, is simply the lack of having what I call the big six needs that children have met in childhood. So, in your family of origin, if you don't have your needs met, and your needs are for attunement, responsiveness, engagement, I've got six of them, but we can just start with those three. You needed high levels of attunement from your parents. You needed high levels of responsiveness, and you needed high levels of engagement. And if you grew up in a relationally impoverished home where those needs were not met, then you are going to be insecurely attached as an adult.
Mm, mhm. So what's the difference between attunement and engagement?
Attunement is your parents' ability to read something of your inner emotional state. In other words, how you're feeling, how you're doing, how you're when you're 6, 8, 10 years old. Engagement is your parents' intention to draw out who you are as a boy or a girl with all of your quirks and idiosyncrasies. In other
Mm,
words, as the Bible says, train up a child in the way they should go, not the way I want my daughter to go, but the way my
mhm,
daughter has been created to be. So
mm.
engagement is drawing out a child's hopes, dreams, fears, longings, so that you can know who that boy or girl really is.
Thank you. That's great. Oh, shifting from the personal story then maybe to like our social or cultural kind of stories. How do those different layers of stories kind of function? How do we kind of make sense of these multiple stories that we're all a part of?
Well, you've got a family of origin story with your parents, your siblings, whatever your family looked like, and that story needs to be explored. You also have the story that your body is telling you, and that needs to be explored. You've also got your sexual story. We're all sexual beings, and that needs to be explored. But another aspect of being human is you're in a culture. You're
Mhm,
part of a collective. Actually, each of us is part of multiple collectives. So, for example, if you are Korean American female, you are part of the collective of women, and you need to know what it's like to be woman in a patriarchal culture if you live in the
mhm,
US. You are Korean, so you've got your Koreanness that needs to be explored. You've got your Americanness that needs to be understood. And then third, and perhaps most complex of all, you're Korean American.
mhm,
So that's a third collective that you belong to. And what does it mean to explore the nuances of what it's like to be a Korean American woman in a white supremacist culture? Like, you've
mhm,
got to put language to that. And that applies just as much. This is the emphasis of that chapter for me, to white folks as it does to minority folks. So, white folks don't tend to think of themselves as having a cultural story to explore, but they
mhm.
do.
Right. Well, what is the religious cultural story too? I remember when I was in college, I was at a secular university in California, and someone someone came up to me and was like, you're a born again Christian, and I was like, aren't all Christians born again Christians? And then they started talking about, well, no, there's like born again Christians and there's mainline Christians that are, baptized as infants. And I didn't know any denominational history at that point, right? So I didn't really know all the stories of denominations and fundamentalism and all this kind of stuff, right? So how do those different stories, the spiritual stories, kind of fit in and shape with this?
Well, you've got to put words to the particular strand, if you're Christian, of Christianity that you grew up with. And whether that's evangelicalism, whether that's mainline Methodism, like Quaker, whatever your religious and spiritual background is, that has profoundly shaped the neurons in your brain. And you need
Mhm,
to know something about that lens that you were raised in, so that you can understand why you move about in the world the way you do. So, for example, for you, when that person put language to you're a born again Christian, it gave you, I just thought I was a Christian,
mhm,
because it was normal for you. But his otherness or her otherness in the sentence opened you to new levels of understanding who you were in terms of social location.
mhm. Yeah, and it was helpful to then start peeling back those layers of my own religious formation. So going back to what you said at the very beginning about shalom and integration in the Old Testament is, we're recording this episode right now during Holy Week, which is a particular story. And part of Holy Week, it comes out of, the Passover, which is Israel's story. And Israel taught, you know, Moses commanded them, like, the elders are supposed to teach the children why we do this, and they're supposed to kind of live as if they had just experienced that event, even if it's 1,000 years later. They were the ones who were freed from Egypt, and they were the ones that were, carried through the waters. So how can we take the best of kind of our Christian spiritual kind of story? How does that story, the story of the Bible, story of salvation, Alpha and Omega, however we want to think of it, how does that then start fitting and helping build coherence in our story? How do you see those working together?
Well, the Christian narrative is contained in the 3 days of Holy Week: Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Friday, trauma. Crucifixion is trauma. Betrayal, powerlessness, abandonment. Saturday is you don't know it's going to be okay. That the Old Testament metaphors for Saturday is wilderness, desert, valley of the shadow of death. It's what the psalmists call the pit. Sunday is resurrection, healing, wholeness, shalom restored. That's the Christian narrative. And Kathy Lorzell, my friend, developed what she calls the U diagram based on that narrative. And it's a diagram that helps you understand the healing process. There's no way to jump from the trauma of Friday to the healing of Sunday without the descent. And the
Mm,
descent refers to feeling big, uncomfortable feelings like sorrow, grief, terror, rage that your body holds from your traumas, but you were not able to feel those feelings and receive care for that trauma when you were a boy or a girl. And so you're now 48 years old, engaging your story, and these feelings come up. You're in the Saturday experience. You
mm,
don't know it's going to be okay. It's the sense of, if I start crying, I'll never stop.
mm,
If I
mhm,
feel that terror, it will take me under and I won't be able to function as a husband, a father, a coworker. I don't
mm.
know it's going to be okay. That's the Saturday experience. And most people want to avoid Saturday. They just want to skip from Friday to Sunday, and you can't.
Why do you think it is that people want us to Sunday so much?
Because on Saturday, we're out of control. We don't know that God's going to come through for us. We don't know it's going to be okay. And we're feeling very big feelings that are deeply unsettling, dysregulating, and uncomfortable. And very often, sadly, our communities abandon us when we feel those feelings because they don't have the courage or the
Mm,
strength to sit with us in those big feelings.
mm. Well, thank you for that. That leads me right into my last question, which is how would you encourage others, whether they're pastors or spiritual directors or just people in churches, how would you encourage them to create environments within the church that allow for that kind of Holy Saturday kind of processing and work?
Top down. The leaders have to do the work first. And then if they're doing the work, it will permeate sermons, worship, community groups. It's how organizations just happen. Whatever the leaders are doing trickles down into the organization, whether that's a church or a corporation. That's the
Mm,
case. That's just how human organizations operate. So the leaders need to go first and engage their own story.
mm. Well, then how do you get the leaders to do it if you're not one of the leaders in these organizations?
Uh,
That's
sub-
always the question.
subversively,
Uh,
subversively. My experience is that most of the people that are leaders in this work, if they're part of a church community, they're doing it on the side, kind of like guerrilla warfare in little pockets where they find like-minded warriors who are willing to step in with honor and honesty to the truth of the heartache of their traumas. And very often, sadly, the leadership does not go with them on that journey. But that's
mhm.
cowardice and a lack of maturity on the part of the leaders, and it's something to grieve.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's tragic that it feels like we have whole church systems that are built around avoiding that Holy Saturday moment. I just want to live always in the triumph of resurrection, and I think that's what leads to a lot of the church hurt and church abuse that we're seeing that's so prevalent. Well, so you're doing a lot of stuff. You have the podcast, which we mentioned. You have your kind of private work, but you also kind of have this rolling mini conference series. Could you just speak about that a little bit?
Sure. I'm doing 12 conferences in 2025. So 4 of them have already occurred, but there's 8 left. And they're on the first Saturday of every month. I do it with a different collaborator or co-presenter. If you're interested, you can go to adamyoungcounseling.com, and all the conferences are listed there. You can buy them one at a time. You don't have to buy all 12. And the conferences are designed to help you step into the particularities of your story in more depth.
Mhm. Excellent. So you can find those at adamyoung.com, and your podcast and everything is there. That's the best way to
No, it's
find you.
adamyoungcounseling.com.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I think it's my notes here. Great. Well, is there anything else that you'd want, just based on what we've talked about today? Anything you'd particularly want a listener to kind of take away from our conversation and maybe start applying in their life?
Yeah, just that I would invite people to take their story seriously. Your story matters, and you deserve to have it told by you to a trusted listener who can care for you well in the context of your stories of heartache and harm. And so the book, Make Sense of Your Story, is intended to be a guide and really an invitation to take your story seriously and to help you do it.
Well, thank you so much for putting in the time to write that book, and thank you for taking a moment and jumping on with us today.
Thank you, Jeff. It was good to be with you.